Good morning again, and welcome to the lecture on wine in ancient Rome. I guess I should start by saying in vino veritas. All right. Let's start talking about Italy. Italy had its own indigenous winemaking tradition from a very early date. Among the Etruscans, who it is thought arrived in the peninsula probably from somewhere around present day Turkey. So that would make perfect sense. They would have brought wine with them if they, and viticulture. In fact, we're not actually sure where the Etruscans came from, but it's pretty clear that they did not learn making wine from the Greeks. They had it before. And perhaps more importantly, it was the Etruscans and not the Greeks who taught the French how to make wine, surprisingly enough. A story just came out a couple of years ago in 2013 that Etruscan pottery made in 525 BC was found in a place called Latera in the south of France, and that's a Celtic city, and they contain wine residues on the pots and so forth. So I'm not sure how they got from evidence of shipping to evidence of making wine. That seems like a disjunct to me, but in any case, there's wine there before the Greeks would have gotten there. And needless to say, we have known all along that wine was made in Italy by the Etruscans in the center, and then later the Greeks bring it to the south of Italy. So it's there very, very early date, certainly. But the French loved the idea that it wasn't the Greeks that brought them wine. I don't know why. So I'd like to focus, though, on Rome itself, because there was an extensive wine culture here, and it's quite different from the Greeks. They are the ones who introduced wine to most of Europe. And in many ways, the culture of wine, the drinking culture, was very different from that of the Greeks. For one, the Romans, well, they also mixed wine with water. It usually wasn't done in a crater, in a big container controlled by the symposiarch, but rather each individual would decide the proportion for him or herself. They would add wine to water or the other way around. And the Romans did drink during the meal. That's the very big difference. The Greeks had it as a party afterwards. The Romans had wine with food during the meal. And the Romans also flavored their wines with herbs and spices, anise, for example, or they would, intentionally add resin to get that flavor, not just for lining the sides of the amphora. They also really liked their wine chilled with snow. So people would actually go up to the mountaintops, gather snow wrap it in hay and bury it so it would stay, and then you'd have a little bit of ice and or snow in your wine to make it chilled, which is really, it's very pleasant actually, especially in the hot summer. So, and for various faults, or also to help the wine last longer, they would often add things like seawater to it. And I know that sounds absolutely abhorrible, horrible, but Cato gives that kind of advice to agriculturalists and what kind of wine to give to their slaves. And he said, give them wine with seawater. I guess it won't go bad or something, but it sounds horrible. But let's start with Cato. He's a very interesting figure. This is a guy who was a Roman politician, infamous for insisting that after two lengthy wars, having defeated Carthage, which is a Punic Phoenician city, remember, that they should fight another one and destroy the city, which in fact they did. He used to get up on the podium and say, "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. They took him seriously and did it. But he wrote this very interesting guide to agriculture. It's called De Re Agricultura, about 200 BC, and it's actually the oldest piece of Latin in prose that survives. Meant primarily for investors who wanted to buy land, people who maybe retired after service in the military, or who had inherited money, or people who wanted to just invest in manufacture of cash crops that they could sell to the city. And I think it's very clear because he says you have to be near waterways or roads, and it's market gardening. It's not for subsistence or anything. And the owner is actually not even living on the farm. He hires a farmer to handle everything. But the products are for profit. They're things like olive oil, fruits, and vegetables, and of course the big cash crop is wine. So this is quite different. It's not long-term travel. It's supplying these very big cities, like of course Rome itself. But why Cato is so important for us is he gives us the very first detailed description of how to build a wine press. And this is a huge machine with a massive crossbeam, a windlass, meaning there's a a block and tackle basically that goes up and down. So you when you pull, you increase the weight that goes on because it's just the law of physics, I guess. Um, and as that windlass tightens, it brings down the weight of the beam on the grapes so they can really, really be intensely crushed, and you can crush a lot at a time. The labor, very interestingly, he also describes that you might have slaves on your farm to do daily routines, but when tasks like this came for the harvest and for processing, you really did need to hire um, day laborers, contract labor in the harvest season, because you wouldn't want to have to keep those people around all year and feed them and clothe them and everything. So the most important thing to note is that wine in this period is for export, but not really long distance. The hither parts of the empire would have had their own wineries, but it's seen as an investment. Okay, it's definitely a business, and I think that what this means is Italy had wine very early in Europe, before elsewhere, and they exported it short distance primarily, but also some long distance. Certainly in places where the legions would have been stationed and couldn't grow wine in let's say Britain. That was one place they would send it. But what I find most interesting about Cato in regards to wine is that the good stuff, the straight, unadulterated, fermented grape juice, that was the stuff that they sold abroad. That's the stuff that they exported. And the household uses, that was a little different. They used wine with cooked grape must added to it, and that would add, of course, sugar and give you a higher alcohol content. Or they would drink something in season, which I guess we can actually try and make if you like. It's called Laura, which is made from the the used grape skins and the pits. After they've all been fermented and been crushed and all the wine is separated, you still have yeast and stuff and a little bit of residue left on the grape skins. So you add water back to that. And then it gets this light pink, slightly effervescent drink. It's called piquette in France, and it's actually very refreshing. It's kind of light, and it's sort of like a light grape soda, if you want to think of it that way, with a maybe 2% alcohol. And so Cato says when the vintage is over, and this is before the wine is actually ready, which should take a few months, they can drink the Laura for a couple of months, and it'll be, in autumn, it's just a light, refreshing kind of drink. But in the winter, of course, he has much less savory concoctions. He says, let me read you one. These are just bizarre. To 12 quintals of must in a vat, 2 quintals of sharp vinegar are added, and 2 of grape syrup, and 50 of water. Into this is stirred 64 pints of seawater. So it's salty and tastes a little like fish, I guess. And then, and so, this is the stuff that they had for the household during winter after the Laura is done. They didn't drink the wine themselves in that household, which is really interesting. It's for cash. Cato also has recipes for correcting wine that turns out too harsh, one that has a bad aroma. He says take a roof tile, heat it up, and throw it in the wine, and that supposedly gets rid of the bad aroma. And in fact, you'll find that much of the agronomic literature about wine growing, and there's tons of this stuff, especially when we get into later periods. A lot of it is how to correct the faults in wine, how to do things when it goes a little sour or bad smelling or whatever. There are also, let me mention, the ancient Romans made other products out of wine, which is very interesting. They used the must, which is just the freshly squeezed grape juice, and they used to cook this down into a condiment, which is called sapa, and that's basically just a thickened grape syrup, let's call it, and they would use that because remember, Romans didn't have sugar, so either you used honey as a sweetener or you'd use this sapa, which is a really pleasant grape syrup. And there were different strengths of it also. So if you boiled it down to 1/2, it was called de frutum. They also had caroinum and passum, which is raisin wine, sweeter, and they use that in cooking a lot too. Wine that's sweetened with honey is called mulsum, and that's something you'd have like an aperitif before a meal. It's supposed to open your body's passages to get ready for digestion. So the state, used to distribute these things to the poor. but as an for political support, basically, that have parties and they would hand out wine. Um, and the one that I think is most interesting, and I think maybe we'll make some of this, or I'll bring some in, is something called conditum. That's a spiced wine. It's in the cookbook by an author, or at least attributed to an author named Apicius, Marcus Gavius Apicius, who is a real person. We don't know if the cookbook that survives actually was written by him, but it's a fantastic book of recipes. But the very first one in the book is for Conditum Paradoxum, a sort of mystery wine, I guess, if you want. And I make this all the time. It's actually one of my favorite things. It's sort of a mulled wine, um, but it's served cold and fresh, and it's a light wine. It's a white and has spices in it and things like that. He says to filter it through charcoal. And the one time I've done that, it turns out this really bizarre, unappealing green color, which is not so nice. But let me read it to you. It's a very interesting thing, and actually the pictures of the one that I made with filtered through the charcoal are actually on Google Images if you look for my name and Conditum Paradoxum. But anyway, let me read this to you. Put 15 pounds of honey into a bronze vessel along with 4 cups of wine. So in cooking, the honey and wine mix. Okay, this is a lot. This is a pound of honey is that much, right? So you're using very little wine to loosen it up. On a small fire, dry twigs, heat the vessel, stirring with a stick while it cooks. If it starts to boil, sprinkle on some wine or remove the fire so it settles. You don't want to burn this. Okay? When it cools, heat again a second or a third time, and it's finally removed from the fireplace. Skim it the day after, then add 4 ounces of crushed pepper, 3 scruples of mastic. Mastic is the resin that comes from the lentisk tree that grows on the Isle of Chios. Okay, and it's mastic. And the word masticate comes from that, right? So when you chew stuff, it's this gum that you chew, mastiga in modern Greek. So you're adding mastic, gives it a nice resiny flavor, a dram each of bay leaf and saffron, 5 toasted date pits. I'm not sure what those do, but they're in there. The dates themselves softened in wine. The same kind is used before and then ground up smooth, so it's sweetened with dates a little bit. When all this is prepared, add in 14 bottles of fine wine. So here the wine, the bulk of it is actually the wine, and strain through charcoal. And when I did this, I reduced it by a 14th. So I guess I used one, the equivalent of 1 bottle of wine, and then, or 2 maybe, and a relatively small amount of honey to start with. But it's really pretty fantastic. So despite all of this, the way the Romans, you could say, adulterated their wine, there was nonetheless general agreement that the best wines were not mixed. And there's a few different agricultural writers. The one that's most interesting to me is Columella. He's actually from Spain, and he says the most excellent wine is one which has given pleasure by its own natural qualities. And think about that for a moment. The tasting nature without messing with it is in some periods very fashionable, in others it's not. So he speaks of a very specific aesthetic of the natural flavor of wine. He says the best vines are usually trained up trees like elms or poplars, which allows aeration, a lot of sunlight. But they did have trellises, like sort of the way we have posts with a T that you run them along. And he said that these have lower yield, but of course they're much easier to harvest. You could just walk along and pick them. When you let the vines go up trees, you've got to get a ladder and go up the tree. But that's fairly typical, to let vines like going up trees. That's what they're designed to do. And he said that they're more concentrated the fewer grapes you have on the vines. So the trellises actually sometimes can make a much better wine, which is true. We also know the Romans did age their wine, and here we're getting into something very interesting. Roman law, which was largely concerned with quality standards of wine that they would sell wholesale. They wanted to make sure that the state guaranteed that it wasn't bad. They made a distinction between old wine and new wine. Now, we don't know exactly how much that was, but the latter, for some kind of wines, and this we get from literary evidence, a Falernian was the wine that they would leave longest to mature, and they said it shouldn't be served until about 10 years old, and it's best between 15 and 20. Surrentine, which is a wine that comes from Sorrento in the south. They said that's best after 25 years. So this is the first time we really have a kind of connoisseurship of leaving wine to mature, and in fact, if it has enough tannins and acid in it, it'll last. You have to really know what you're doing to make wine that will last 25 years. It takes a great deal of sophistication and consistent temperatures, and it has to be a good wine to start with. So, lest we jump to comparing these to modern aged wines, also keep in mind that what were considered the best wines in all the ancient world were white wines, okay, not red ones, and wines that were sweet. So I think the expectation was that these would darken a little in color, become a little more amber, maybe even oxidized over time. Because remember, they're not airtight. They're not using corks. They don't have bottles or anything like that. What it does is it gives the wine a slightly nutty flavor and a slight caramelish color, and it's got a different taste. And in fact, if you ever taste like a sweet sherry, that's also an oxidized wine. It's got a very distinctive aroma, not fruity necessarily, but it will last for a very, very long time. And the other strange thing about the Romans is we would expect that they would put their wine in the basement, or in a cellar where it's constant temperature, 55 degrees. But they often stored their wine in the attic above the hearth, which is weird, and this would, of course, give it a slightly smoky flavor if it penetrates the clay vessels that it's stored in. So this is a process that's similar to what is called Madeirization. Okay, it comes from the word Madeira, which is an island owned by Portugal, in which you take a high alcohol wine, you heat it, and then the wine actually ages quicker. So what they're doing, strangely, is heating the wine, and that will advance the oxidation. And if it's a sweet wine, it'll become like a Madeira, which is a very specific, very special kind of old wine, sweet. So I think if you, or Marsala is kind of similar also, another oxidized wine from the south of Italy. Wine was also, like in Greece, connected to religion in Rome. The Romans worshipped Dionysus, but they had a different name for him. They called him Bacchus. They also had their own indigenous wine god, whose name is Liber Pater. And in fact, there's a festival called the Liberalia, which is his feast day celebrated on March 17th. And the word liber, it's probably liberty, it's the same word. It means free. So on this day, 14-year-old boys were officially declared free citizens. They got to wear a full toga. They got to vote. And if you think about it, also, the word libation, to take a drink, comes from this word, okay? So the root is free, freedom, coming of age, but a libation comes from liberalia. There's also a special sacrificial cake, which is called a libum, and Cato actually has a recipe for this. It's basically, if you can imagine this, it's flour mixed with cheese, something like a ricotta or a cottage cheese, and then held together with an egg, put them in kind of ring molds so it forms a cake, and a few bay leaves are put underneath so it doesn't stick to the bottom of the thing. Remember, they don't have non-stick pans, that sort of thing. But it's really a remarkably good cheesecake. The Liber and Liberalia, his consort, were also gods of fertility. So on this day, in the countryside, people would march around with a giant phallus, walk around the fields, and ensure crop fertility. And so that's one, festival connected to wine. Another is the Bacchanalia, and that seems to be actually more of an ordinary drinking party in Rome. We have called them, although there's a different meaning also, but we usually call them orgies, right? So an orgy just means that lots of people get together, get very drunk, and sometimes it goes the other direction. But the Romans, strangely, the Romans were not like the Greeks. And the Greeks had one set of gods. Every city had a god. They had sacred islands and spaces, temples to them. The Romans kind of collected religions. They were really into mystery cults from the East, and they would dabble, and you didn't have to choose one religion. You could dabble in lots of them. So some Romans would dabble in Mithraism, which is a worship of a bull. Some dabbled in Christianity, which when that arrived. So just get the sense that it's but the Romans are actually very, very, at least to start in the Republican period, they're actually very stern and religious people. They take their religion very seriously in a way I'm not sure the Greeks did necessarily. Um, so instead of the symposia, the Greeks had a party which is called a convivia, okay, or convivium in the singular. And it's a little different type of party. They still lied on couches, these three couches lined up in order. That's called a triclinia. You'd have three this way, and three this way in a U shape, and three people would lie on each couch, and so they'd, be sitting, you'd be facing everyone else, but there'd be someone in front of you here and someone in front of you there. It's kind of a weird way to party, but and women were invited to these. That's the big difference, is women were not excluded, and it's a kind of social event in which you would kind of show off the kind of wine you had, show off your sophistication, and of course your wealth, right? If you could afford really expensive wine. And Horace, who's a satirist poet in ancient Rome, in a satire of a party, mentions that there was Coan, Caecuban, Chian, Falernian, and Alban wines. All the first few are Greek. The latter are expensive, but they're local wines. The satirist Juvenal also wrote about being invited to a banquet like this, and the odd practice of the host getting really good food and the guests who he's writing about, presumably someone that the host wanted to insult, actually, sitting way in the back and getting really bad food, which seems like a really strange thing to us. But they would do this, apparently, is that sometimes the guests of honor would get really good stuff and good wine, and the guests who were not so honored would get terrible food and bad wine. So let me read you a little bit of this. While your host drinks wine when the consuls were bearded, juice of grapes that were trod during wars 100 years past. Okay, the consuls in the time Juvenal was writing didn't wear beards anymore; they were clean shaven, and so this is really, really old wine. But the guests get wine so bad that blotting paper would shudder to sop up wine like this, which turns guests into madmen. Okay, and he doesn't share the host doesn't share the good stuff. Will he send one thimbleful to his cardiac friend? No, never. Tomorrow he'll drink again from Scythian or Alban mountains, the jar so black with soot and dust that he cannot even tell where it came from. So, like today, people thought in ancient Rome that age was an indicator of quality. And Juvenal isn't really denying that. He's saying there's good stuff and there's bad stuff. But when the consuls had beards was like over a century before. So they're apparently keeping stuff for a long, long time, and people believed it was still great. Another really important topic is the spread of Roman viticulture. Rome itself had a population of probably somewhere around 1 million, was clearly a draw for wines throughout the peninsula, right? People would send their wines there and sell it. Colonists also brought the grapes to other parts of the empire. So wine gets to Spain this way. It goes to the Rhone Valley, even though the Etruscans may have introduced it in the very south first. It goes to some of the greatest wine-making districts in the world. The Romans introduced grapes there, to Burgundy, for example. They also introduced it into the Rhineland and the Mosel in what's today Germany, and even in Romania. Romania, remember, was a Roman colony. And basically all the places in Europe that grow grapes and make wine today, it was the Romans who brought the grapes there. Strangely, officially, if you wanted to grow grapes, you had to be a Roman citizen. And the idea of this was that they expected they would maintain a big trade with the colonies, is that the colonies would still be importing the really good stuff. If they had tons of cheap wine, they wouldn't need that. We don't know if that was ever enforced, but at least that's a law in the books. So to make wine, you have to be a Roman citizen, until the year 212, in which Caracalla decided that anyone could make wine. He's sort of the proponent of free trade, I guess. Okay, and the wine trade was very important from Italy and throughout the empire. Most wine was still carried in ships, in amphorae, those big clay vessels, and these are literally found everywhere in Europe's waterways. Shipwrecks would go down, and the whole cargo would go with them. So throughout the Mediterranean, on the rivers in Britain, through the Rhone, the Rhine, the Ebro in Spain, the Garonne, all of these places have shipwrecks of wine carrying vessels. Ships carrying wine vessels, is what I mean. And a much larger forum vinarium. There was a big sort of space for storing wine that would be shipped in Ostia. And Ostia is Rome's major port. It's the ruins of that still exist. It's really pretty amazing if you go there. The whole city is sort of, it looks like it was shaved off at an angle. One side the buildings are almost complete, the other side they're almost gone. It's really interesting. So anyway, Diodorus Siculus says this about the wine trade that goes to Gaul, what's today France. The Gauls are exceedingly addicted to the use of wine, and fill themselves with the wine which is brought into their country by merchants, drinking it unmixed. Scandal. And since they partake of this drink without moderation by reason of their craving for it, when they are drunken they fall into a stupor or a state of madness. Consequently, many of the Italian traders, induced by the love of money which characterizes them, believe that the love of wine of these Gauls is their own godsend. They ship them whatever they want. For these transport the wine on the navigable rivers by means of boats and through the level plains on wagons, and receive for it an incredible price. In exchange for a jar of wine, they receive a whole slave. This is, he may be exaggerating here, but clearly this is before Gaul is conquered. The Celts, remember, as beer drinkers, if they could get their hands on wine made by the Romans, they did it, and the Romans apparently exploited them, right? And sold it for a great price, and Celts got drunk on it. But that was the 1st century BC. What happens is this whole region was conquered by Caesar, actually, Julius Caesar. And before extensive colonization, the first thing they did was start putting in vineyards in what's now France. And thereafter, of course, the trade collapsed. Why would you buy stuff from Italy if you could grow it yourself? In fact, grow some better wines in France. And what the evidence that they have for this, I think it's sort of convincing, is that the amphoras stop. There are no more after that. The wrecks with amphora in the ships and remains of them broken, which suggests that they stop shipping it, that they're drinking it locally. And the other part of the evidence is that Rome grows stupendously in this period, and it seems like anything that was grown in Italy, Rome could take up the slack. They could just send it to Rome. Even by the era of Cato, really, it makes sense to send to Rome. And the vineyards kept expanding. The price of wine goes down dramatically, and I think it's safe to say that wine was the everyday drink for everyone, regardless of wealth, regardless of status. Quite different than most other ancient civilizations. It also appears that the quality of wine dropped as the manufacturers targeted Roman population. In other words, they just made very cheap, low alcohol wine of a kind that strangely you can still buy in Rome. If you go into a supermarket, you can buy a bottle of wine for about $1 or $1.50, something like that. A light Frascati or something like that is really, really cheap, and people do drink it as a table beverage, and not to get drunk off of it or anything. It's food, absolutely food. So this is also a period when taverns proliferate, and in fact, in Ostia there's a tavern that is pretty complete. You can walk into it, and I think they could just start serving drinks there today. It would be a perfectly lovely place to sit down and get wine. There are also remnants of them in other places that have been excavated. Herculaneum, and of course Pompeii has the most extensive ruins. There's a volcano dropped ash on them, and everyone was frozen, even drinking. And Pliny actually tells us. Pliny is the ancient author, tells us that wines from Pompeii are at their best within 10 years. But gain nothing from greater maturity. So 10 years is about the limit. They are also observed to be injurious because of the hangover which they cause, which persists until noon on the following day. So I don't know whether that's evidence that wine in general got cheaper and worse, but he apparently had a good hangover from the stuff. Another very interesting phenomenon is now that wine didn't have to travel so far by ship, nor was it sealed so well in amphorae hermetically. The first time they start thinking, let's come up with a vessel that is not going to break so easily, and that can be moved. You can put greater volume in the vessel and move it around without having to carry it, and maybe that could be stored in a much easier way. So this is where the barrel is invented. It's in antique times. It's a very interesting kind of process. But the interesting thing is about a barrel: you put it on its side, you roll it, you can stack them up and put them in carts. You can definitely transport much more wine in a barrel. It's not great for long-term storage. This is the irony. When today we make wine and put them in barrels for flavor. But you don't want to keep it in there too long, and even I think the evidence is that, and there's nothing left, right? They didn't even have metal hoops. They used willow branches and things for the hoops, and those don't survive. Very, very few. And so what this suggests is that a lot more wine was consumed locally, put in barrels, served out of the barrel. And of course, once you start tapping a barrel, remember, the level of the wine goes down, it begins to oxidize, it'll go bad much, much quicker. So the barrel is not a storage vessel, it's actually the serving vessel. It's what you take the wine out of. And I should probably talk just a little bit about barrels, because they're really an interesting thing. A barrel is made by cutting staves very carefully at an angle so that they will fit together and form a joint as they're placed in a circle. And then there's a hoop that goes around it that holds the whole thing together, and obviously a bottom and top. But what's interesting is the inside is toasted, and so this is going to give a different flavor to the wine. The oakiness, the char is going to add a different flavor, and it's going to make it last longer. So we're getting closer to modern viticultural techniques and oenological techniques, and the barrel is certainly a key invention here that comes from late classical antiquity. So probably the best source of information on wines, the kind of wines that came to Rome, is Pliny the Elder. Okay, he wrote this book called Natural History. It talks about plants and animals and a lot of nonsense in it, but it's a great fun book. And you probably know that he saw the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 A.D. And described it. He got away, and regarding wine manufacture, he mentions, for example, that vines are trained up trees and they grow so high, and it's difficult to harvest them because the workers are hired. He says in the contracts for the people who harvest the grapes, there's often provision for their burial and including a pyre, because so often they'd fall off out of the trees, and it's hard, if you're really climbing up to get the grapes, like I did this morning. Actually, I almost fell off once. But he says he's seen grape vines covering an entire house. He said the colonnades of the house of Livia has a bower that grows and yields 84 gallons of grape juice every year. So clearly they're using all sorts of very interesting ways to grow grapes. Grapes will go anywhere as long as they can climb up. The vines trail around, and they have little tendrils that grab onto things and hold on, and then they keep going. And he says in places where it's windy, like the south of France, they intentionally keep their vines short on stumpy little vines that become fatter, and then they can pick by hand, and they don't get blown over. So, and you'll actually see vines like this. If you wander around Lodi, the old vine zins, there's still a lot that are over a century old. They go back to the mid-19th century, actually, and they are not on trellises. They're just trained they look like little trees. They're very, very cool. So, most amazingly, Pliny says that some years are much better for making wines, and especially the year when Lucius Opimius was consul. Okay, this was the year 121 BC. He said this was the best weather ever for grapes. And he said, writing some 200 years later, that wines from that year still survive today, even though they have now evaporated and are the consistency of honey and have a slightly rough taste. Such is the nature of wines when they are old. So that seems to be suggesting that he's actually tasted these wines that are 200 years old. And you might know, wine from the early 19th century. You can still buy bottles of that. You could even buy a bottle of wine from Thomas Jefferson's cellar. It might be a fake, but it's there's claims, Chateau Margaux, that came out of his cellar in the late 18th century. So let's talk about another banquet scene that involves wine. This is in a satire by the author Petronius. It's called the Banquet of Trimalchio. Okay, this guy who is a kind of nouveau riche idiot. He's a host who's trying to really impress people by throwing this lavish banquet, but he has no idea what he's doing, and he has money but no taste. Okay, so he serves a Falernian opimium, which is labeled as 100 years old. And I'll quote the Petronius himself here. While we were examining the labels, basically they labeled their wine, Trimalchio clapped his hands and with a sigh said, "Wine has a longer life than us poor folks. So let's wet our whistles. Wine is life. I'm giving you real opimium. I didn't put out such good stuff yesterday, though the company was much better class." Now imagine saying that something that is so rude. That's the rudest thing in the world. He's saying this is really great wine and I'm putting it out, and even though you guys don't deserve it because you're low class. That's just horrifically rude thing to say. And again, the wine actually, if it had really been a Pimium, would have been 180 years old. So I think Petronius knows that people are going to get the joke that the Trimalchio had no idea what he was serving and was just doing it because people thought it would be expensive and he was trying to impress them. It'd be I don't know, someone. The audience would have gotten the joke that this guy is an idiot. But it is exactly the type of wine that you would have bought for someone because it's expensive, not because it's good. And I want you to think of this. The Roman society was very, very aspirant. The social climbing was very important. Trimalchio actually worked up as a slave to become this big, wealthy speculator in grain, actually. And this is fictional, of course, but it reflects the kind of mobility that people would have had in Roman society, and exactly the kind of society where giving someone a wine like this, that's really expensive and probably garbage, would flourish because people don't know how to do it. They think buy something expensive, that'll impress. So just keep in mind. That's a great example of what we were talking about distinction. Okay, and why in a culture that's very socially mobile, distinction is very important. What you buy, what you consume, as a reflection of your social class. So let me keep going with Trimalchio. He brings out a little skeleton and he says, "Alas, how less than naught we are, fragile life's thread and our brief day. What this is now, we shall be. Drink and make merry while you may." So it's a very funny story for a lot of reasons. Cicero also has something very interesting to say about wine that's aged. When he wrote a series of letters, which were discovered not that long ago, and they're actually a very good way to learn conversational Latin if you ever have a chance to do it. But he wrote these letters to his friend and gives you an idea of what everyday life would be like. And he said, "It is as if a man were fond of Falernian wine, but did not want it so new as last year's, nor again so old as to search out a cask from the vintages of Opimius, that's 121 BC, or Anicius, which is 160 BC. But those brands are acknowledged to be the best." And he says, "Yes, I know, but too old a wine has not the mellowness we want, and in fact it is scarcely longer fit to drink. If that's then is one's feeling, need he go to the other extreme and hold, if he wants a potable wine, that it must be drawn fresh from the vat?" And he says, "Certainly not. We would look for a wine of moderate age." This is a letter to his friend Brutus. Brutus presumably asked him, should I buy this bottle of really expensive wine because it's supposed to be great? And everyone goes, ooh, ah, ooh. And he says, "No, it's past drinking." And he says, "Well, then do we drink the fresh stuff?" And he said, "Well, it's okay, but get something of median age." And that's aged moderately before it's started to go really nasty. Very interesting, insight into wine tasting, I think. Very, very, very correct, in fact. Dioscorides was a first century AD pharmacologist, botanist. He went all around writing about plants and things. Said that wines from different countries will differ. So this is in a book called Materia Medica. It's in the 5th chapter. He says, "Falernian is old and easily digested, but don't take too much as a drink. It's really, really intense and heady. Caecubin is sweet and fattening with good color, but it's very bad for the digestion. Serentine affects the head less because it has light particles and becomes more pleasant when older. Mamertine from Sicily has thick particles and affects one's strength less because of its mildness. Um, and the falernum that they're talking about, incidentally, is grown on the slopes of Mount Falernus between Latium and Campania. It's just to the south. And people went so crazy for this one wine that the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, great Stoic philosopher too, he's a fascinating writer, said this: "Surely it is an excellent plan when you are seated before delicacies and choice foods to impress upon your imagination that the Falernian wine is grape juice." and so the reason he's doing this is he says, if you have really expensive, elegant luxuries, you get addicted to them, and the next day when you don't have them anymore, you're going to be much sadder than the day when than if you'd never known about them at all. It's a very Stoic attitude toward abstinence. Is just stay away from this stuff, and you'll never become addicted, and you won't need it. But people were impressed by the name Falernian, and a tavern in Pompeii actually had prices scratched onto the wall, which still survive today, and it says for one as that's a unit of money. For one as you can drink wine. For two you can drink the best. For four you can drink Falernian. So that's the really, really, really good stuff. And to give you an idea of how much that cost, a loaf of bread cost 2 as. So it's not ridiculously expensive, but it's the name. Well, let's put it this way: it's a marketing gimmick, right? The name becomes a brand, and you hear that and you say, "Oh, I'll pay 4 times as much as a regular thing of a bottle of wine," or they don't have bottles yet, but a drink of wine. And Pliny also said it is the only wine that takes light when flame is applied to it. Now, what that suggests is that this is really, really high in alcohol. And without fortification, the highest percentage you can get on a wine is somewhere around 16%. And that kind of wine definitely will not burn. So people have always wondered, what is Pliny talking about? Is this distilled? Because if you take a match to distilled wine, eau de vie, or aquavit, it will catch on fire, definitely. But distillation probably hasn't been invented yet. So this is a really interesting. We'll come back to this. Why he says that. You also might know, strangely, there is a cocktail syrup called falernum, which is made with almonds, ginger, cloves, and lime, and it's made in the Caribbean. It has nothing to do with falernum, the wine, but I don't know how it gets that name, honestly. There's also a poet named Catullus who apparently wanted this. It was so good that he said, "This you have to drink straight. Don't cut it with water." Let me read you. This is Carmen, the song number 27. "Come, boy, you who serve out the old Falernian, fill up stronger cups for me, as the law of Postumia, mistress of revels, ordains. Postumia more tipsy than the tipsy grape. But water, be gone. Away from you, water, destruction of wine, and take up abode with scrupulous folk. This is pure Thyonian God." It says, "This hic meris est Tionianus." This is the real thing. And Tionius, I should say, it's another name for Bacchus. So you might say, here is the unadulterated devotee of Bacchus, and you drink it straight, not watered down. So let's turn to the medical benefits of wine. Galen, who is in that Hippocratic camp of humors that we spoke about, discussed the properties of various kinds of wine, and he really interesting figure. He's Greek, but he went to Rome to get a job, and he landed pretty much the best job you could get, which is physician to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and he was sort of the medical authority for the next 1500 years or so, until we get to the scientific revolution, believe it or not. So his opinion basically influenced everyone's opinion about wine in the Western tradition and in the Middle Eastern also. Probably more than any single individual. When people are wondering, what is wine good for your health, they're going to look to Galen first. Let me read him to you. "Everyone agrees that wine is one of the things that gives nourishment. And indeed, everything that nourishes is food. One would have to say, then, that wine is in the class of foods." Okay, it's not beverage, not pleasure. It actually nourishes your body. And he says that, yes, there are some physicians who disagree with me, but he says that because it nourishes your body, replenishes your blood, it has to be considered food, not beverage, not like water. Okay. And I think his, particular medical association of wine with blood has something to do, I'm not sure what, but we'll come to this when we get to Christianity, with the idea that in the Eucharist, the wine becomes blood. It's the idea that it can change into it very, very easily. Of course, it does in your body. And I think in Christianity, just imagining wine transformed into the blood in a miracle would have been very easy for them to understand. So let's get back to Galen, though. He says that the thick red ones are the most useful of all wine for the production of blood, since they require the least change to become it. So the logic here is it's called assimilation. Substances that are closest to our body in substance become us in the process of digestion. They turn into us, are assimilated, become part of us the most easy. So by this logic, wine is very nourishing. It becomes our blood. Meat is very nourishing. It easily becomes our flesh. But foods that are different from us, humorally and in terms of substance, are not nourishing. Vegetables are not nourishing. Salad is really not. Fish is really not. It's too cold and moist. So keep this in mind. When we get to Christianity, this will actually become an essential consideration that'll explain a lot of fasting regulations and that really do go back to Galen. Another thing to consider, though, he says, is the power of digestion. Some people have very weak digestive systems that can't break down coarse substances. So he says in this case, especially if don't get a lot of exercise, if you're a scholar, white wine is much better. It's not quite as nourishing, but you don't need that much nourishment. He says this: wines that are white in color but thin and consistently are the least nourishing of all, whereas thick wines are more nourishing than thin ones. The former are harder to digest and distribute throughout your body. So if you don't get a lot of exercise, drink white wine. If you're a scholar or someone like that. So the point I want to leave you with here is that in the ancient world, for the Greeks and the Romans, wine was a daily beverage, gave them nourishment, maybe not as many calories that can be used as, say, beer would, as it did among the Sumerians and the Egyptians, and of course among the Germans and Celts. But it is nonetheless something that people would have on the table every single meal. And it's safer to drink than water. I think that's a very important thing. It hydrates you. People often think, oh, you get dehydrated when you drink. Well, if you drink a lot of wine, yes, you get a little dehydrated. But most of wine is water, of course. And it does give you some nutrients and vitamins, and it's a good thing for you. And I want you to sort of think about how a culture decides the value of an alcoholic beverage or any intoxicating substance. Really depends on the context. It depends on the ideas they have about it, what they think it's going to do to them. And for the ancient world, wine was not dangerous. It was not something they needed to worry about. And drunkenness is not really a problem for them. Why? It's interesting. There's no diatribes against it. There's no, inveighing against the sins of alcohol, which we'll see certainly in other periods. It doesn't seem to be there in the ancient world. But next time, when we talk about the Bible, we'll see some real ambivalence. We'll see some warnings. We'll see people getting drunk. We'll see people enjoying wine. But the Bible is really the root of the Western tradition's fear of alcohol, especially in excess. Of course, it's central to Judaism and of course to Christianity. You cannot have those religions really without it. But there's also a real fright against wine, because you may lose your reason when you partake of it. And we'll see a couple of weird events where that actually happens. So I will see you after this.